All right. Well, I am here with the play's author, Ben Hatt, who really thrilled that we got to experience that and really looking forward to September. It's interesting to see your life come to art and kind of interested to just hear from you, Ben. Where did the inspiration for this play come from for you?
Yeah, I think my interest in writing plays and writing art has always been trying to find topics that I don't know the answer to. And I find art a wonderful way of exploring that, and sinking your teeth into it and coming up with characters that offer different perspectives. And I was reading about content moderation. I can't remember the first article that I read, but what it took me in is something that obviously is so central to the content that we consume online, and more and more so. And I think what really gave me a way into a play like this was when I was reading about content moderation. There was a through line of what some of the content moderators or former content moderators who had been interviewed were saying. And they were saying that it wasn't so much the images that stuck in their mind, it was the sound. And when I read that, it just unlocked a way into telling a story where I hope this kind of gave a teaser for that, where you, as an audience member, you never see the content that Leo views, but you do hear it, and it allows an audience to kind of fill in the gap. And so, kind of having that way in, and then it just kind of led me down the rabbit hole of reading more. And I had a friend as well who was a real kind of way in as well, who she did. It was similar to content moderation in that she had to review content from the New York police for body cam footage. And so there was a similar approach to thinking about what can be released and what can not to. And so speaking with her and doing that research kind of led me down the rabbit hole of wanting to better understand what this was like. And I think it really centered on the crux of it then kind of that I centered on in wanting to explore this play was just, humans have a role to play in this. And yet at the same time, how do we reconcile the impact that this has on the humans who have that role to play? So that's kind of, where it all came from.
It's interesting you mentioned the sound. I think a lot about, I was at Facebook when we launched video, if memory serves, and the shift there from having to sift through content that is still can be traumatic and bad, but you unlock a different dimension, and all of a sudden people had to wear headphones, for instance, right? Because now you are reviewing content that has sound, and different pieces like that. And it really, it brings an extra dimension to it that is, kind of, I think, very interesting. As you did your research for the play and you were kind of learning about content moderation, what really stuck out to you, besides the kind of sound piece? Were there things that you learned there that really kind of, help shape how you either thought about it or really kind of carried with you?
Yeah, I think certainly. I think the excerpt that we saw today offers just a small fraction of the overall kind of scenarios that come into moderation. And I think something I didn't realize until I really started going down the rabbit hole was some of the more nuanced scenarios that come up. One thing I remember reading, for example, is about the cultural specificity of moderation. Something that may be okay in one country may not be okay in another country. How do you sort of take that into consideration? One thing, another scenario that I thought was interesting is they talked about, I was reading an interview with a content moderator who was moderating around 2014 when the sort of war in Syria was happening. And the sort of regulation that they were working under was that content that was related to that war was allowed because it was seen as being newsworthy, but content related to kind of drug trafficking in Mexico, which may have a very similar visual or audio experience, was not allowed because that wasn't deemed newsworthy. So I think in that research, it really, and another scenario which actually kind of gets explored later on in the play, not to kind of, give too much away, but is something, for example, around like giving birth, which is actually a very joyous experience, but where regulation because of the sight of blood maybe or so on might not be allowed. So I think all of those scenarios just point to a matrix of complication and nuance, where I think we when we think of this content, we first think of immediately as of gore and shock and horror, but that actually circumstance and culture bring a lot more nuance to the conversation.
That's, I think that's a really important point, and I think there's kind of two things to really tease out there as you think about the world of content moderation, which is, one, sites set the rules that they want to have enforced and followed. There's actually not a lot of illegal content, particularly in this country, given the First Amendment, but that's, kind of more true than you'd expect worldwide. And I think that means that on some level, you have to create rules, and people will disagree about rules, and, we can talk about that. But I think your example on, the war in Syria and Mexican drug trafficking is true. I experienced this at one point in my career. The bombing in Boston happened at the Boston Marathon, and there was a particularly grisly photo of somebody who had lost a leg in that incident. And under Facebook's existing rules at the time, even a newsworthy photo, if it was like a severed limb or too gory, like there were kind of qualifications to what we allowed. And a bunch of very senior, a bunch of people in the world thought this was really abhorrent. Kind of non-Facebook people saying, I can't believe Facebook would censor something like this. And some senior executives were kind of also upset and had some questions. And so the team that was in charge of enforcing it, who had written this, I think what is important to understand about content moderation is essentially you have to break everything down into component parts that anybody can understand or execute with not a great, grasp of language, with kind of kind of following certain steps. And so, the idea was, okay, if photo A has severed limb B and enough gore more than C, like that would be, not something would be okay. And so kind of the answer was, if you want to let us show this newsworthy photo from the Boston bombing, like the consequence of that is you will likely allow other kinds of photos that have similar content, right? And the answer was brushed aside. And a few weeks later, and some of you who've had the unfortunate reality of seeing it, a video went viral on Facebook of somebody in Mexico being beheaded by a cartel. And people were very upset that the rules allowed this to stay up. And the answer was, under the metrics we had changed for the Boston bombing, that now was in. And so, but why was one different than the other, right? If you break that down into its component parts, a person with a grievous injury, and so, these kind of things are really, I think it's important to note, neither of those photos in this country and in many countries, neither of those videos are illegal, right? It is not necessarily illegal to show death. And so, it is a particularly unique and complicated world that is, particularly on news or other pieces, extra complicated.
Yeah, I think you point to a through line that I came in the research that I was doing as well, in speaking to people and reading interviews about people who have done this work, is that it's so, the regulations can be very prescriptive to what you see. So it can actually narrow a moderator into kind of not being able to have any critical thought, because they have to very specifically adhere to these very prescriptive rules around gore, or did we see this thing or that thing, and as you say, when there are differences in circumstance, differences in newsworthiness, it can make it complicates the factor. But I wanted to ask you, because you talked about at the beginning, you had friends who were involved in moderation in the early days of Facebook. You have also been involved in writing legislation and thinking about moderation as well. And you've spoken to some circumstances as well in which you've seen these discrepancies based on cultural circumstances or newsworthiness or so on. How, from an individual perspective, when you were working at Facebook, to kind of being on the outside now and thinking about legislation, how have you seen the topic of content moderation evolve?
It's a great question. I think I'd say two things. One of the things that happened when Facebook, started to grow was it really became kind of the way that the masses really interacted with different forms of content in a way they hadn't been able to, and be exposed to other kinds of content in a more kind of easy way. Beforehand, maybe you'd go to a handful of websites, as you were getting on. And there was a strain of the internet kind of prior to it being really easy to access content that there were people on the internet who really prided themselves on searching for more extremes kind of content to kind of being kind of more free speech or libertarian online, and kind of these, and so there was kind of a clash of attitudes with Facebook in particular, which had kind of more restrictive rules than other sites at the time. So kind of very famously, we didn't allow nudity, was kind of a thing that people didn't like. We didn't allow people to use fake names for a long time. They had to use their real names. And these things were, I think, controversial for all sorts of different reasons. They kind of made the site possible to have a mass level of appeal. I think you don't get to, say, 300 million, 200 million US users or whatever without, if you are slamming the site with pornography or other things when you come on. And I think what we've seen, for instance, is Elon Musk has taken over X and really relaxed their content rules, which were already much more permissive than other sites. Is like you can log onto that site and see like a tremendously unexpected and shocking amount of content that you're not expecting, and I would not say necessarily makes the experience a better one. And I think that some of that has obviously trended in the far more extreme in way there. But it is, when I started my career and as we were writing these rules, we were kind of often accused of Facebook of being kind of overly censorious in various aspects, in a way that obviously has changed since then. I don't think it's changed for some of the core aspects, like Facebook still, as I understand it, doesn't allow nudity, although there's so much AI spam on there now, like it probably, but like, these are things that like were tremendously controversial, still remain tremendously controversial to a set of people, but kind of have generally become an accepted practice for kind of site modernization. Kind of same with excessive gore or other things as well. You mentioned the childbirth kind of story. It is a beautiful moment. I can tell you from firsthand experience, because it did happen to us one time and it was a viral moment, I believe. Like, it is tremendously jarring to open your Facebook feed and see a birth you were not expecting from that perspective. It is. And I think it can be a beautiful event. It can be a surprise, I think, is one way to put it. And so, my friend Dave Wilner, who wrote the first set of content policy rules at Facebook, later went on to work at Airbnb and OpenAI, kind of having to discern a set of values and what you care about and how you do that is really difficult. It's an interesting white paper exercise when you're kind of starting the blank sheet. Obviously, when you add people to it, it gets more complicated. And what Meta has done now, relaxing these rules, I think is even worse. I will say the thing that we tend to flatten on in conversation is we tend to hold the networks accountable, or we tend to hold, talk about the impact on content moderators, both of which are true. But I think the overwhelming thing I took away from my experience of having to see or deal with or think about the policy implications is like, we don't do enough to hold people accountable. Like, people put terrible things on the internet pretty constantly, and we all just kind of like assume that's fine. And it just like, it is bad, and it does make you lose a little bit of faith in people if you sort through that.
Yeah, I think that's certainly something I wanted to explore in this play as well. Like, as we see Leo going down the rabbit hole of being exposed to so much of this content, like how does it impact his relationships? How does it impact his feelings on people, and his cynicism? And I worry that there's like, and Leo is obviously an incredibly extreme example by being overexposed to such traumatic content. But, we live in a society now where like we're always on our phone. We have all of this content at our fingertips, and we can get overexposed to such a range of content. And now we think about since I started, writing this play, since you were working at Facebook, the tools that are at people's fingertips are so much greater. Like what you can do with AI content, generative AI content. You start asking questions around, well, if nudity is not allowed, what about generative AI nudity? What about, like, you're suddenly having to open up the Pandora's box, like, even more. And so I think that the questions that that we have to contend with as a society and as people holding other people to account are kind of exploding more and more as more tools are at people's fingertips to put content up online.
Well, I want to be mindful of time. I think we'll talk one more thing. We'll do our interactive exercise, and then we'll take some audience questions to wrap up the day. You talk a little about it. You mentioned it in the play, but, how did you think about AI as you were kind of writing this? And, kind of what is your sense of how both AI in the context of player, but AI as an artist, right? As somebody who is trying to generate original content and original work. Like, how do you think, both in the context of this play, but also in as an artist, are you thinking about AI?
Oh, I'll take that as two separate parts, because I think with the play, it was I I started writing this play in 2020, and AI was not something that was a general tool of consumption by the public. And then as I've been toying around with this and playing with this, it's obviously become a much more important part. And I think also, as you spoke about at the beginning, it's definitely moving in the direction of the desire for AI to displace people in moderating content. And I think as that's become clearer to me, I don't know whether this is like just a philosophical thing that I've been wrestling with as I've been thinking about the play, but it seems like we have different options here. There is either a role for humans in moderation, or we kind of hand this all over to AI, or we have the sort of X approach of just letting communities moderate themselves. And so if I guess, it's putting the third one to one side at the moment, because I just don't think that works. If we hand over kind of the keys to the car of moderation purely to AI, like I struggle and wrestle with, like, what does that mean for communicating with one another, that we allow just an algorithm that may have inbuilt biases or develop maybe inbuilt biases or is not in conversation with other human beings? What does that say about us, that we're letting that kind of arbitrate our discourse? And if we do have humans involved, it goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, is that, like, if we do see that there being a value of humans in moderating this content, then what does that, how do we reconcile that with the psychological impact, the mental toll that comes with what people like Leo are experiencing? So, and then as far as an artist goes, I'll be brief on this, but I feel it's a similar thing where I worry that we're getting to a point where, like, AI is becoming so ubiquitous in our lives that we're going to start relying on AI to, rather than using AI as a tool, we're going to use it we're gonna let it guide us. And I think that's a very dangerous place to be as an artist, because with the way that AI works, that it scrapes the information that's already there, if we use that, it's going to bring us back to the mainstream. It's not going to encourage fresh way of thinking and fresh discourse in artwork. So I think there's still a tremendous amount of value in starting with an idea and using AI as a tool and not using it as the guiding star.
Absolutely. So we're going to do a little exercise that my old coworker and I sent to me. So this is me in my youth once long ago with my good friend and former colleague, Katie Harbath. You should subscribe to her Substack, anchorchange.substack.com. I have to plug that because she comes up with this as a presentation she gives sometimes to people to talk about how executives or others should make content moderation decisions. And so in this example, I'm going to show you a slide. I will just say now, it is not going to be an actual image or video. It turns out that's a very complicated thing if you're going to show something controversial. So it will be words that we can describe to you. And the reason we do that, for instance, I will tell you a story. My first year at Facebook, we were getting protested very famously because we were not allowing pictures of breastfeeding mothers on the site. Our no nudity policy wouldn't allow that. And they protested outside our office by breastfeeding outside our office for an entire day. And a news crew came up, because what you do when you protest is you have news crews, and the news crew filmed it. And they asked us for comment and said, why wouldn't you allow this? And we said, are you going to put any of the footage of the mothers breastfeeding on TV tonight? And they said, absolutely not. That would violate our standards. We said, okay. Not quite sure why this is a complicated discussion, but, so we'll go through that. But what we're going to do is, there's lots of options. You can take them up. But basically, let's do this for binary's sake. What I'm going to do, I'm going to read this description to you. Everyone will have 10 seconds, and you can raise your hand if you want to take it up. Sorry, if you want to leave it up or take it down. And then I'm going to ask somebody to speak about why they might do that. And this is just to give you a sense of the challenge in doing this. You don't have all the information. 10 seconds is about as much time as a moderator has, for instance. So let's see if this works. So one, a post is spreading that says the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, agents are patrolling polling places. And let's presume polling places on election day. You have 10 seconds, and you can tell me, and then I'm going to ask everybody if you think this post should be taken down or left up. Okay. Raise your hand if you think this post should be left up. Okay. And raise your hand if you think this post should be taken down. Okay. Just one or two. That's good. It seems like the vast majority wanted to leave it up. Anybody want to speak who wanted to take it down? Yeah, go ahead.
I thought this post could potentially dissuade people from voting. So interfering in elections might be something in my tech company that would not be allowed in their moderation standards.
Reasonable point. Anybody want to speak to why they would leave it up? Sure, over here. We got a mic coming for you.
I think people should be aware of what's actually happening and be able to take a stand with it. I'm actually a poll worker every election, so.
Thank you for your service. Both reasonable perspectives, and there'll be more. Again, you don't have full context here. You don't know if it's true or not. For taking it down, there was a time where that was against some rules, but it's complicated, right? And you don't have a lot of information. The president of a country releases the phone number of a journalist during a live stream on your platform. All right, 10 seconds. And then... Okay. This one's open for a little bit of interpretation, whether or not we're taking down the video or the phone number, but, who would... let's do the phone number. Let's make it easier on people. Raise your hand if you would take the phone number down off your platform. Okay. And raise your hand if you would not take the phone number down. Okay. Anybody want to talk about keeping it up? Or sorry, about taking it down. Sorry. Let's start with that. Why you would take the phone number down? No volunteers? Sure. Over here in the corner. Here, we'll bring you a mic.
Well, a journalist isn't a public official, and if it's their private phone number, it seems like there's a privacy issue in addition to potential other issues.
Very reasonable take. And on the opposite, anyone want to volunteer? Leave it up. Sure, in the back there.
I think the fact that it's the president of a country makes me think that what a president says should kind of follow the president. So I think they should leave it up for that reason.
Both valid, I think, answers and a reason. Yep. Sure.
Do you know how they got the phone number?
Do I know how they got the phone number? I will say in general, presidents have more access to get phone numbers than the average person. So I think it's a little more ancillary than that. But no, I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. And you would not necessarily know that context in making it a snap judgment either. All right. You find somebody has shared a shockingly horrifying photograph of a naked Vietnamese girl burned by napalm. And we will give folks a few more seconds. Okay. Raise your hand if you would leave the photo of the naked Vietnamese girl burned by napalm up. Okay. And raise your hand if you would take it down. Okay. This is about half and half, I'd say. This is a little more difficult. Is there anybody who would like to speak to the raising? I will say this is not a hypothetical. This is a very famous case that happened with Facebook, and we can talk about the details of this. But anybody who would like to explain why they think you should take it down? Raise your hand. Yes, in the back there.
This is a tough one because I could see the newsworthiness component of leaving it up, but because it's a girl, I don't know if there may be issues with it being a minor, where different privacy concerns come into play.
Absolutely. And for keeping it up. You want to speak up front here?
I'd say keep it up from a historical historical explanation as to why you're showing it, not just to sensationalize it.
Great. Very reasonable point. So some background on this. We don't have the entirety of this right, but essentially Facebook took down the kind of famous Pulitzer Prize winning photo of a naked burned girl burned by napalm in the Vietnam War, sparking a huge outcry for this. And I think you can now, having seen the 50-50 split here, understand a couple of things. One, if we're talking about the kind of cold, regulation is not the right word, the rules a platform uses, right? This is a minor. This minor is naked. That actually, unlike most things, is actually a crime, to put that up there. There's not necessarily a newsworthy exemption for that, although kind of in practice there would be. And there was a kind of great outrage up to the, if memory serves, the prime minister of several countries kind of spoke out against this about this photo being taken down. And again, the moderator took it down. One, there's also some, I think, unfair expectation that every person in the world should know every famous photo, which I think is, again, maybe not a realistic, but very controversial. Now, the question is then, if there is a similar photo that didn't win the Pulitzer Prize, what do you do with that? And that's, again, hard. Now, I think it should be just noted to say, content moderators get the gray area stuff because it's harder. It's because it's harder, right? The easy stuff we can use a lot of machine learning for, or you can use a lot of AI for. But so like this, and what are the values on it? Or do you make a mistake and say, we wouldn't do that in the future, that sort of thing. But that is a really complicated one for a variety of reasons, right? And I believe the final one, a viral post starts off, women should be treated as property. 5 more seconds. Okay. Everybody who thinks the post should be taken down, please raise your hand. We've got 2. Everybody who thinks the post should stay up, raise your hand. Okay. More on that. Don't have to, but if anyone wants to speak about why it should go down, feel free. If you don't want to call anyone. Yes. Absolutely. And anybody keeping it up? Want to speak? No. Oh, here in the back. Yeah. Right there. Anyone else? No.
I think we should know the mindset of anyone who feels that way.
Great. Again, very reasonable in all of it. You can imagine now, this is a post. Often these are superimposed on top of an image, it's text, you got 10 seconds to do it. So I think this exercise hopefully has been a little bit imaginative and collaborative. We'd love to take audience questions if you have any now. And as a thank you to my former colleague for making this, subscribe to her Substack at anchorchange.substack.com. Last 5 minutes, any audience questions for Ben or about the topic? Great. Yes, you there to start, and then I saw someone over there.
I was curious if that lack of context is how the moderators actually have to make the decisions. What if that's just, that last statement could just be a statement that's made at first and then a whole reason why it's false comes after it? Do they have to make the decision right at the first expression, or like the famous photo? They would
have a little bit more. I mean, they would have the full context of whatever post it was. So, for instance, if there were, 2 paragraphs after that, they would have access to see that. They wouldn't necessarily have access to see everything. For instance, if it was my post, everything that I had posted necessarily. So there would be a little more context than that, but not necessarily a lot more context. Now, there is certain kind of content that generally gets reviewed for kind of deeper investigation. So if it looked like your video of somebody getting shot was one you filmed and maybe it was a crime, that gets referred to a different team. But in general, for kind of basic content like that, you're going to get kind of just the aspect of what's on the post and not necessarily anything more.
And I would just add to that you touched on, and I think I tried to address in the play a little bit, that this time pressure that is on moderators to moderate a whole stream of content is, in the play he talks about moderating almost 2,000 pieces of content in a day. How much time practically are you going to have to delve into the context of any specific post?
And I think to Ben's point earlier, the kind of contractor nature of it in particular, the time nature, the kind of you're stuck here just being fed stuff, that's a really difficult job. I think if it both is created kind of by humans, if not AI, to have to do this. But if it gets replaced by AI, I don't necessarily mourn its loss. I will say there are the roles themselves are not inherently traumatic if you were able to do something about it. So, for instance, you will find the people that have to investigate terrible images, what we call CSAM, which is sexual exploitive material, but they get to investigate and help those people get arrested. They have a tremendous job satisfaction, even though they have to see pretty terrible things, because they are able to impact the outcome, which is, I think, different from just having to absorb terrible information.
Yeah.
Other question over here. Yeah.
I'm assuming that most content moderators are men. I don't know that. As the author, does it make a difference that Leo is a man, or could that be played similarly by a woman or a non-binary person?
Yeah, I think the role of a content moderator could obviously be played by any with man, woman, non-binary, someone from the US, someone from abroad. But I do think that, where the challenge comes a little bit is you obviously bring in your own biases, you bring in your own experiences, you bring in your own perspectives on things. We're all human. This is what comes with being a human moderator. And so some stuff is going to strike you as particularly upsetting in a way that it might not strike someone else. And so whilst I don't know the data behind, if there are more men or more women or so on, but whilst the role of a moderator can be done by people from different demographics, Leo is just his own character, and he brings into the story that own kind of his own biases, perspectives, and so on. And so in the sense of the play, I would say it has to be Leo.
There are a tremendous amount of women involved in content moderation, and so it is not necessarily one that heavily skews gendered, unlike, in fact, in many ways, it's probably more representative than the rest of Silicon Valley, where obviously engineering jobs tend to skew heavily male. Other questions? Yeah, blue shirt there.
This is our last question.
I'm just going to stand up so I can see Ben. This was a question that came from your comment on when you described the three options that companies have when it comes to the future of content moderation. I just wanted to hear you say a little bit more about why you think sort of community moderation might not be the way forward.
I worry that if we leave communities entirely to themselves and don't have any human moderators, or at least even an AI moderation program, then we could be exposed. We could leave on platforms incredibly explicit material. So I think at a certain point we can agree that there has to be some level of moderation when we think about the extreme form of content that could be up there, if there isn't that. And then I think, I worry about when you leave something to the masses and it's unfiltered. Then, especially when we see an increasing amount of mis and disinformation, when we're seeing AI generative tools becoming increasingly more convincing, it requires a approach that goes beyond what can be achieved by a community. But that's my personal feeling. I'm wondering what you think.
Yeah, there's always going to be a legally required minimum level of there's just some stuff that is illegal. It's not immunized by Section 230 because it is illegal and criminally illegal. So there's like a base level of stuff, but you could get rid of just the base level of stuff and still have a pretty dramatically hard to maneuver through without being traumatized site. I think in general what is probably most true, and you see that even in Elon Musk's X, is the images and videos that are more extreme, particularly that are real, or maybe even too, but like images and videos tend to be something that like has a base level of like people want to at least be able to opt in to seeing more extreme content. That's a very difficult balance. So you tend to see more there even in those sites. What I think is I think much more open for discussion and reasonable disagreement. And we see is like text, right? It is words. I think kind of moderating words is really hard. And kind of has always been, even though they're the easiest to create online, been kind of the most controversial part of it. And then you kind of get to the parts where, like I said, you can have plenty of stuff that's legal. It's not a super appealing. And the kind of different thing is also extreme content, if you're fine with it, like you're only fine with a couple of forms of extreme content generally. Then you like get uncomfortable with it. So, I think generally the kind of multimedia, I think, is a different, and you will always see some level of either content moderation or control if they can, but it's, again, increasingly difficult to do unless you can kind of machine classify it at best. But words, I think, are much more likely to be moderated by a community in a way that's acceptable. Well, thank you all for coming. We appreciate it. Ben, tell us how they can find the play later.
Well, if you can keep an eye on the Theatre and Policy Salon website and the Theatre and Policy Salon social media. We cannot quite announce the venues yet, but for everyone who RSVP'd this evening, we'll be following up with an email nearer the time where we can give you the details for if this piques your interest and you want to come and see the whole thing. So thanks for coming.
Thanks, everyone.